say, oh, really wanted to be there, couldn't get there, let one of us know, and we'll get the link to the recording to them.
Yes.
The people presenting today will be clergy and lay members of our annual conference. We're not delegates to the annual conference, we're actually members of. The annual conference is made up of us, clergy and lay. So, and we have this goofy Methodist way of talking about these things that my formerly Lutheran husband likes to make fun of frequently, which is to say that the annual conference refers to a geographical region. Our California Pacific Conference goes Southern California, about up to San Luis Obispo, and then Hawaii, Saipan, and Guam is the California Pacific Annual Conference, which meets every year in June for about 4 or 5 days in a session called the Annual Conference. So it's the annual conference of the conference, which nobody says because it sounds too silly. But if you sometimes have trouble with these terms, it's because it's a very particular John Wesley way of talking about geography and people and church. So we gather in order to conference as a verb. For Christian conferencing, so it all becomes a part of that. So we're going to start out today. This will be an overview of this past annual conference session held at the University of Redlands and we're going to start out with a short video of some clips that Adam Ferrero, who is one of our members of a conference, made for us for this morning. So let's give a little round of applause to Adam, and then we'll
was assigned a voting pad that had a specific number on it. And so you had only 2 lines for a lot of people. So I missed most of the service. And I understand it was extremely rude, but a lot of them talking. I wasn't there long enough for near the end of the service. They had members of their task force going out, standing in the aisles, and you could be anointed going up and requesting, basically in acknowledging your lack of leadership in these things, and be anointed, with oil in this. That was a very moving experience, and he did it and said the Father, Son, and the Spirit. Well, those of you who know me rather well know that I'm quite a feminist. And I'm that, and well, anyway, I finally got enough gumption. I went back and I mentioned it to him. And he said, I didn't even think of that. And whatever, he apologized and whatever, he said, would you anoint me? And so I did. I realized it is really the same fight, only it's just got a different name. Does all mean all? That's the basic contention here. The final service, what you saw the procession there for the ordination service. For me, ordination has always been the culmination of the annual conference, where you have people coming in, formal high church service, absolutely fabulous. And when you get 1,000 or so Methodists together singing, there's nothing like it, with this big organ being played. And that, it just kind of epitomizes in the commissioning and ordaining of people who came from our churches to ministry. It's just the culmination. Anything else?
Jack is going to talk about ordination.
As Mary mentioned, and as you saw in the video that Adam prepared, the ordination service is one that is filled with pageantry and grandeur, and it's, as Mary said, it's very high church. There's a procession down the 2 aisles, and all of the people to be commissioned and ordained, and the Board of Ordained Ministry, and all the bishops, and all the clergy, and Bishop Hagia Crozier, and it's very impressive. The process is divided into 2 portions for deacons and elders, and consists of a commissioning service first, in which the candidates, we can show the first 2. This is, in the second you see the candidate kneeling, and the bishop and the other bishops and clergy who is sponsoring the person all lay their hands on the person, and a ritual is performed. If it's commissioning, they then get up and walk back to their seats. If it's ordination, following this, they put the stole, either the deacon's stole or the elder's stole, on them. And as we've said, it's a very impressive and moving service. And realize too that these people who are being commissioned and are being ordained have gone through a extremely rigorous vetting process and have jumped through lots and lots of hoops. And some have failed their first attempt and go back for a second attempt, and which makes it even more impressive. I'd like to briefly show you some graphs that represent the distribution, the ethnic and gender distribution of persons who are being commissioned and ordained. And this shows you the male and female candidates who have been commissioned during the years of 2013 to 2019, and I didn't have data for the 2014 class. Those were commissioned, and this shows the distribution of gender and ethnicity of the persons who were ordained in those years. Showing male and female distribution. On the next slide, this shows for those years the percentage of or the numbers of males and females that were commissioned, and the next one shows the numbers that were ordained. So you see that there's quite a variety of ethnicity in the classes and the ministers that are coming forward. Back in 2005, I believe, see the next slide, Board of Ordained Ministry started a study showing the number of elders retiring opposed to the number of elders who were commissioned each year. And you'll notice a discrepancy there, with the exception, as we see the next one, with the exception of 3 years in that period, the number of elders retiring exceeds the number of people commissioned. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the comparison of those ordained and those retired. The discrepancy is even greater. There are no exceptions.
You missed that one.
Nothing is showing up on mine
Yeah,
either.
okay. Well, if you can
Just
imagine
imagine, just imagine.
you can imagine that first graph with no purple circles consistently throughout from 2005 through 2019, the number of ordained elders retiring exceeds the number of elders ordained, and there's a general trend downward. So this speaks a word of caution to us as to where are the ministers going to be coming from in the future. I'll finish with the statement from the Board of Ordained Ministry, which was issued in 2019 following the General Conference in St. Louis. And if we can have that, we, the Board of Ordained Ministry of the California Pacific Annual Conference, hold our clergy and candidates for ministry to the highest standards of faithful and holy living. Next one. Our practice upholds that people of all sexual orientations and gender identities can live up to our high standards for fitness, readiness, and effectiveness in ministry. At this historic moment in the United Methodist Church, we support all efforts which bring justice to issues of human sexuality. We will continue to give all candidates equal consideration because we believe this is the most faithful way to do our work. We stand in solidarity and fully support all of our colleagues, candidates, and leaders in ministry who endeavor to transform our world through God's grace.
Hello, I get to talk very briefly about the budget and finances. As you know, the church is organized as local church and an annual conference and then jurisdictional conference and then general conference, which is basically the entire world. And we pay apportionments to the upward chain, and it's based basically on membership and the budgets of the various churches. So every church has a certain amount that they're supposed to pay every year to the conference. And we pay ours. There are churches who are not able really always to pay 100% of their apportionments. About 2 years ago, there was kind of a decision to reduce the overall budget of the conference, and so that trend is happening in the last couple of years. The 2019 approved budget, which just ended, was, I should have brought my glasses, $11,951,000 approximately. And so for 2020, the proposed budget, $11,551,000. So that's a reduction that's happened generally over the last couple of years. And hopefully it will make it easier for churches to pay their apportionments. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Let's see. Oh, we can meet. I don't know how you want to go.
What, Jeff? Come here. Come on. It won't be. I can tell you, tell you my ordination story if you'd like. When I went to college, it was a Methodist school, and my friends knew my father was a pastor, and I somehow said he smoked cigarettes. Your father smokes? How could he be a preacher that smoked? These were, righteous people from Iowa. And I went home and I asked my father, and he said, well, when I was in the ordination, I think it was not quite as rigorous as it is now. Not multiple papers and everything. But it was before the board, and they were saying, so what do you think about the virgin birth? And he said, I go with St. Paul on that. What do you think about whatever? He says, I'll go with St. Paul on that. And what do you think about smoking? Whatever. And I said, but Daddy, he said, what am I going to say when the guy asking the question has a great big cigar in it? And I said, well, what did St. Paul say about the virgin birth? He said, nothing. So it's come a long way. Tricia is in the midst of it. Okay, a little levity. Because what we have to talk about is this morass, I would say. This, to give you one clue about annual conference, is what's called the legislative tracking sheet. Now, if you can read this, you've got better eyes than I, which is not to say much, because I have very bad eyes. But along here it's divided into various things: petitions, recommendations, resolutions, and rules. Now, if you could imagine sitting in a hall with 1,000 people, going through each one of these things, you'd be blind and deaf at the end of any 4 or 5 days. So like any good big organization, it's divided into groups and called legislative sessions. When I was working, they went to committees, and then it came to the full city council, and that's how this works. So these different things are parceled out over, I don't know, 5 or 10 legislative sessions. And so you'll wind up with an item on the budget, or retirement, or decommissioning a church, or commissioning a church. And then you get one of the bombshells. And one of the bombshells that I had was one of these that called for amicable separation of progressives and traditionals in the UMC, which was non-concurrence. You have to get to a certain amount of votes in the legislative session for it to go on this main calendar, and then in the big session you vote on concurrence. You just wipe all these off, and you have only then maybe 4 or 5 issues that people really want to talk about. And of course, at this conference, it was this whole thing of, I will turn it over to
I have 5 minutes, okay?
We can give you more of that.
Okay.
Yes.
6.
Let's see. First of all, I should say one thing about the sessions, and that is that for all, it has worked out beautifully. Every single conference I've gone to as a member now, I've been in a session that handled retirement and benefits. Every single
Oh, you
one.
mean wherever you've been?
Yeah, every
It
session.
follows you.
Yes, it does. I'm getting very sick of it.
Well, but I appreciate it very much.
It's one of those exciting things that has to be done every year. Nobody wants to do it. Nobody would volunteer, so they don't let you volunteer. They just hire you. Anyway, let's see. So I actually wrote some stuff out just because otherwise I'm going to forget what the heck I'm doing. Before I want to launch into all the stuff on the legislation, here's one other main thing that we did that I thought was, the result was unbelievably hopeful for the future. And that is, we elected our delegations to the General and Jurisdiction Conference. We have to do that every 4 years. Or more frequently, but that's the elections we had this time around. And we did a quick survey with our little voting machines of the age distribution of the attendees of the conference, and as you might expect, it's relatively weighted towards the 55+ years because, you know, this is the during the week stuff, and there are people who are working, and it's harder for kids and young people to get there. So they're a minority. It's weighted till, but with the people who we elected are in general really, really young. We have a very, very young delegation. And these are people who are excited to serve and interested in serving the church. And of course, these are the people who are the church of the future. We're the church of the present, or in some cases, the past. But it just seems to me that it's really, really hopeful to see so many people interested in what the church is going to look like in the future. So we may think that we're a dying church. There are people rising from the ashes already. And this is a good thing. This is very hopeful. Now, let's see. Before we start to talk about the really big issue in the room, we ought to lay a couple things just as a reminder, a couple data points. About 5, 6 years ago, our jurisdiction put out a statement that said that we were going to operate as if the language in the discipline that is so restrictive to the participation of the LGBTQIA plus community. There really ought to be a shorter word for that.
Especially in the clergy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really.
Yeah,
think
it's-
that's debatable about lay people, but
It-
legal who it is.
It's full participation. And so the jurisdiction said that we essentially would now, we being the jurisdiction now, would essentially operate as though that language simply didn't exist. And as an example of that, how that would work, the way discipline works is the bishops of the jurisdiction are the ones who have to actually carry out punishments and things like that. So if a minister does something terribly against the discipline, like preside over a gay wedding, the prescribed punishment in our jurisdiction is 1 day's leave from duties with pay. How this is different from taking money off, I don't know. And I think that was the point, is that we are simply going to ignore it. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
So that was some years ago, and that's the way the jurisdiction's been operating for some time now. Well, we had this little meeting of the General Conference in February, as you'll recall, and in which the bishops had given a plan to make this basically a general church thing, not just our jurisdiction. And it was called the One Church Plan, and essentially it was going to give jurisdictions and annual conferences the ability to make some decisions on their own so that they can operate best within the cultures in which they're situated. This is kind of common sense. There were, of course, people who were not fond of that, and they put forward a thing called the Traditional Plan, which is pretty much the opposite of our One Church Plan. It tightened the screws. It did things like mandating in the discipline a penalty for presiding over a gay marriage. And it would be more than that. It would be 1 year suspension of duties without pay. That's a little different from money off.
And don't do it again.
And don't do it again, that's right. And there were all sorts of things in the plan. People would, if you suspected your pastor was gay, you had to report him. It was the police state stuff. It was really, really, really nasty. And it actually was carried.
By very few votes.
Not by many votes, and there's some contention over whether or not the voting was strictly by the book. But be that as it may, this tells us something about the trends in the general church. And we have to ask ourselves the question, is this a church we actually want to be part of? And that's where things get interesting. So we're envisioning a new church at this annual conference we just attended. And in the back of everyone's minds is the question, okay, is this really truly going to be a new church, or is the Methodist Church somehow going to change its stripes? Well, I don't think that latter thing is terribly likely. Among other things, the demographics of the General Council, of the General Conference, are not even so slowly swinging towards stuff from outside the United States. It's almost 50-50 now, and it's going to get worse with time. Worse in the sense that our part's going to go down. How big was
The population, you mean the socioeconomic
the
or?
demographics?
The demographics.
How many delegates attended like five conferences ago from our annual conference?
Basically 9 clergy and 9 lay.
And it's down to 3 and 3 for the next for us. So one of the ways that our influence is being diminished is we simply aren't going to have a presence there.
Where is this?
At General Conference.
General Conference.
This is General Conference. And this is not going to get better. It's not going to fix itself.
Because of the diminished church attendance in the Western jurisdictions.
Right, right.
Whereas in other jurisdictions, a lot more people go to church. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah. And unfortunately, all that church growth is in places where people who disagree with us.
Therefore,
So we're losing.
therefore the traditional.
Yeah. So the odds of having the Methodist Church suddenly see the light and become a nice, open, inclusive church are really pretty slim at the moment. So in the back of everybody's minds, the question is, what are we going to do? So we had a bunch of resolutions on the map here. Several four from those of us who actually support the traditional plan, and there are some in the congregation, in the conference who do. From the various statistical studies that we got to do with our voting machines, it looks like it's somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 20% of the members of the annual conference support the traditional plan. And the other 85% are roughly split approximately half and half in favor of leaving the global connection and doing our own thing, or staying in the global connection and working for reform. And by personal opinion here, I don't know what those folks are smoking. I mean, we had the one church model on the table in February, and we lost. Right? And that's probably the high point in the number of votes we're going to get. So the traditional plan is what we're going to be stuck with, and my guess is the screws are going to get turned tighter, because the majority of the global church is in favor of doing that, okay? And they'll probably be happy to see us go.
But not our money.
But not our money, of course not, of course not. They would love to have a way for us to walk away but still pay for them. How that would work, I'm not quite sure, particularly since, all of our contributions are indeed voluntary. If our conference simply decides no longer to support the global church, that's one of the simple signs that we're leaving, isn't it? We simply stop paying our way, and we ignore anything they tell us. And at that point, we are effectively gone. We don't even have to say goodbye.
I can't see that happening.
I can. Anyway, so there were 4 resolutions that they presented. I don't say they, the part of us who agree with the traditional plan had 4 things on the book here, all of which, by the way, when you actually read them, seem to accept the fact that our annual conference will be leaving the global church. And these resolutions were designed to protect the rights and privileges of the individual congregations that didn't want to leave. Okay?
20%.
Yeah, the 20%. And that's it. And if indeed we decide to leave, we will have to come to an accommodation of some sort with those folks. And this is all doable. But it's something we will have to face. There was another set of 4 resolutions in there by basically the General Conference delegation, which were talking more about how we're going to go about leaving. And those were, needless to say, approved, because there's like 80% in favor of them, and the 4 supporting the traditionalists were not approved because they got like 20% democracy in action. Most of the conference talking about this stuff, though, was all about what we would like the new church to look like. And as a timetable we had talked to, so we were supposed to talk about it here. We're supposed to have something put together that we can actually vote on as a congregation for our in time for our charge conference. And then all that information goes back to the annual conference, and we can talk about that. The way the bishop said, and that's lovely. As long as we have time to do this. My own fear is that we aren't going to have time. The traditional plan goes into effect January 1. There aren't any conferences, anything between then and now at the conference level. Except charge conferences, yes, but there's nothing conference-wide in that time interval. So, to me, that's the elephant in the room that no one really talked about. That's what I really hoped to hear in this conference is, what are those first steps?
I had the impression that we're just talking and talking and talking and, oh yeah. Looks like, to me it came down, it almost sounded like each congregation decides on their own whether to stay with the traditional plan or not. And I thought, well, something's missing here. And Patricia has indicated that there's finally some kind of structure coming. And maybe this is a good time to...
Do you have more you want to say, Dick, before I transition into that?
Not me too.
How many pages is that?
2, but that's okay. They're stuck together, so I can't even see the second. There's nothing that I haven't covered anyway.
Well, that's better.
A bullet will blow up in my face.
We had the really harder part of the presentation. And so what comes next? And there were a few people that couldn't stay for this today were hoping that they were gonna hear the answer to what's gonna happen.
Wouldn't that be nice?
And I keep saying, it's gonna be a while. And actually, I'm gonna disagree with Dick on a few things here, which will come as no surprise. And only time will tell how this is actually gonna go. So yeah, there's a lot of talking that's going on. And you heard the word from the bishop about doing our own listening and talking and coming up with a statement about what we would like, what we see the new church to be in our own context. Who does Santa Monica First need to be now vis-a-vis our community, our people, and so on and so forth? So how would we formulate that? How would we put that into words? That's what we'll be talking with one another. The lay leadership team will be putting together some conversations, moving towards our church conference, which will probably again be scheduled in November. At the same time, the annual conference is putting together what is called the listening posts, which may be organized by mission areas. So like 5 or 6 of our congregations, our immediate neighbor congregations, might come together to talk with one another about these things. What do we think? What do we want to see happening? Where do we sense God leading the church in this time? And the input from all those listening posts will be collated later this fall, and will go to the bishop and leadership of the annual conference as we are going to look at what will come before the annual conference session next June. All of that will be in flux. At the same time, there will be a Western Jurisdiction Summit in early September, probably somewhere here in the Los Angeles area. I don't have the details yet, but that will bring together people from the whole Western jurisdiction so that amongst our conferences, we can talk about where we think we're going or need to go. Dick talked about the date of January 1, 2020, when the provisions of the traditional plan that were left in place and adopted by the General Conference will go into effect. For those of us in the Western jurisdiction, we're pretty clear, as I said to you before, that all of our bishops support us in all of our ministries. So we aren't personally concerned about ourselves at this point and what might happen. What we don't know is that charges can be filed against us by any United Methodist anywhere. So what we don't know is, will there be a plan from the traditionalist folks to start sending charges related to those of us who are here and known to have done gay weddings and so on and so forth. We don't know that yet. I have an opinion about that, which is just my opinion. I don't think that's going to happen because of the reaction to the adoption of the traditional plan that we've seen across the annual conferences in the United States since May. And this is where I actually see an opening for some new conversations to be happening, because somewhere between 80 and 90% of the conferences in the United States meeting just like our annual conference did in Redlands. So we all meet about the same time in May and June. 80 to 90% elected their delegations to General Conference. As Dick mentioned, we did as too. And in 80 to 90% of the conferences, those delegations are predominantly made up of progressive delegates. That may not sound like much to you, but what that means is that in places like Texas and North Texas and North Carolina and Western North Carolina and North Dakota and South Dakota and Indiana and Illinois and Florida and on and on and on and on and on, annual conferences, some of which in the past would have been painted with that broad brush about being from conservative areas, in fact, elected progressive delegates. This is a major sea change. It doesn't mean necessarily that we will still have all of the votes that we would need to pass legislation at General Conference because of what Dick described in terms of global population and numbers of delegates. However, it does mean that when jurisdictional conferences meet in July of 2020, there will not be a traditionalist plan supporting bishop elected.
Say that again?
There will not be a bishop. We elect bishops at those jurisdictions all across the country. There won't be votes to elect a person supporting the traditional plan to the episcopacy. And of the ones that there are now, their own annual conferences voted a progressive delegation in spite of the position of their own bishop. So those dynamics are really interesting and show, I think, a shift in the U.S. church. And I don't know where it's going to go just yet. The other thing that the study came out this week, and I should get it to everybody, is that what Bea, I think, brought up about where our money goes and so on and so forth. Of those conferences in the United States, 90% of the apportionment dollars come from those now progressive conferences. So, and
You mean the total general
of the U.S. church, of the
of the
U.S.
U.S.
church.
church.
And that of the places that, out of which persons supporting the traditionalist plan came, those conferences have not been paying 100% of their apportionments. So that sends a message to the whole church about where dollars may or may not be available going forward. I say that, I don't mean to say that in a threatening way or in a punitive way, but what I want to say is that there are people across the church that are asking, as are some in our annual conference, how might we continue to be global in mission, as our bishop said, but contextual in organization? Because people, many United Methodists across the United States, want to support things like Encore or building wells in Nigeria that we've been part of, or sending our team to Haiti that we've been part of. All the supporting the e-reader program that you supported on my birthday a few years ago. All those kinds of things that are dear to our heart and speak to our concern for sisters and brothers in other parts of the world. How do we maintain those relationships without having imposed upon us these prohibitions about the LGBTQ community? So that's what, to me, that's where the interesting conversations are going on right now across the United States. There was a meeting just in Chicago just this weekend of a bunch of folks that came together. I haven't heard about it just yet, results. I'll be in another meeting at our conference headquarters in Pasadena this coming week. Lots of conversations going on. Now, to some people, that's frustrating because it can feel like just a lot of talking. But my own vision of it is that it's part of stirring up the pot at this point to see what the that perhaps we haven't yet envisioned or imagined. And so I think that's pretty exciting and actually rather hopeful that we're getting clear on what our priorities and our values are. The question is, how might we organize ourselves to live in a way that honors one another and honors those global relationships? And I would say not only that, but like in our annual conference, we are such a racial and ethnically diverse annual conference. And so relationships that we have with Korean brothers and sisters, with Vietnamese, with Cambodians, with Chinese, in our own annual conference, what ways might there be, many of whom, especially first generation, tend to be more conservative in their theology. Till now, we've been able to have, it's kind of like the one church plan was meant to be, but we had relationships with one another that allowed for that kind of diversity, but out of respect, in love, recognizing our differences, but cherishing all of that diversity that helps make us who we are. And just speaking for myself personally, I would hate to see all of that have to go away in order to have one position around human sexuality. So I'm still hopeful and working. So lots of meetings coming up, lots of gatherings coming up. I'm going to stop so we can have questions, but mainly I want to say, please keep being interested and keep praying, because I really believe that God is doing a new thing. And our job is to stay out of the way and be brave and be clear and be part of bringing that into being. So let's open it up for questions for any of our folks. I don't want to be the only one. Cindy.
So, the thought that keeps coming to mind for me is education. So I think that we all need to educate ourselves. I took a training at UCLA the other day, an online training on LGBTQ. I don't even remember if there was an IA. And there's so much I don't know, and I need to keep educating myself. And so the same as when people of different cultures come together and, talk about your cultural differences and things, and you learn how people have respect for this or that or who people are. So like the word Q, right? The letter Q, I never felt comfortable with the word queer, and yet some people comfortably use it, especially if they are queer, they're comfortably using it. But it also means questioning. So that was wonderful for me to learn. That was a piece of what I learned. And there were wonderful examples on this training, and just little things like that. So I think we need to keep educating ourselves. Maybe we need to have educational forums. Maybe there need to be websites people can click on for information and training. So that to me is really number one. And through that we will grow.
Cindy. Others? Yeah, Joyce.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much, Patricia, for your presentation this morning on a spectrum. Because, what's happening in the Methodist Church is an either or. And I agree with you that it is a spectrum. So somehow my concern then is a charge conference this year for our church, if we are being forced to make it an either or in a vote or some kind of questionnaire or whatever. And I'm wondering if there's some way instead we could word it so that, we are supportive still of people who believe in the traditional plan, that's part of the spectrum, that we're not condemning them, we're saying we're right and they're wrong, So that's, I don't know if you want to speak to that or just how you feel like what might happen at Charge Conference.
Thank you for that. That's been part of our spirit here all along in these last years. So, and Mike is here from our lay leadership team today, so I'm gonna kind of just put that one in your bucket. Because the lay leadership team will be meeting August the 24th, I think it is, and we'll be talking about this process, what kind of process do we want to have with one another, and how do we want to move towards that Charge Conference work. So I appreciate that. So let me go Donna and then Beth.
So the book we read by the woman, the gay woman of San Francisco, is she still completely outraged on what's happened?
She is, Karen Olavito is still a bishop of the United Methodist Church. That cannot be taken away. I mean, unless she does something egregious like embezzles $3 gazillion, which I don't have a copy of. So, but she's still a bishop. There might be charges filed against her, but actually, as I had pointed out in terms of how we deal with clergy, the Western Jurisdiction College of Bishops has already put in place its own processes for dealing with bishops in the Western jurisdiction.
They're not like the ones in the traditional, so-called traditional plan. They're not the same as the traditional plan.
No, and so those processes would continue here. What might happen in other places, we don't know yet. And then Ben.
I just kind of want to reiterate what Joyce is saying, that we need to make sure we don't turn this into a competition, and that we really encourage a lot of conservative people to come forward and feel as though they can at least make their views known.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when we kind of bring up things like there's a lot more progressive people coming on the council, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to make any of the more traditional people feel as though they can speak up. And it has to be a dialogue. We have to try and get them included. And, you know, I'm somewhat concerned that there are people that are afraid to speak up because they know that we're a very progressive church. And in some personal conversations, we're also a very long-standing church, and it's very difficult to move people from their views. And it's okay that some people still have issues with all this stuff. I don't want to kind of whitewash it and say that, you know, that this is where we're going because, you know, the progressives believe we should do this. We have to make sure that the people that have been in the church for a long time still feel as though they have a say in what's going on and that they can at least explain their viewpoints to us.
Yeah. So the last vote where they voted for the traditional, that was in May,
That
correct?
was the general conference in May.
The general conference. When is the next general conference?
May of 2020.
So, isn't it a possibility that they could vote again and it won't be the same outcome as things around the world are shifting? There was a country recently in Africa, I don't remember which country it was, but they passed a law that homosexuality is no longer illegal. Does anybody know what country that was?
I read about it and I can't remember right
Yeah,
this second.
anyway, the point being is
Botswana.
within the next year, until May 2020, things can shift and evolve within the world,
Yes.
where that vote could be much different than it turned. So I have to say, and I don't smoke anything, I must say, I'm in that little group of 20% who is saying, hang in there, let's see how things, if we can, so.
It's 40%, that's 20.
Yeah, you know,
Things will be evolving, which
I'd
is,
like to
I guess,
see.
what
Given
thing I
another
want to
year
turn
to
busy
see.
with today is that, in my mind, all of this is very much in flux right now. And there are people from every point of view who are going to be counting votes, head counting between now and May. So, I mean, all of that's going on too. But things are happening that have shifted the dynamics in the church itself, and as you say, things keep happening in the world and in people's lives that changed our points of view. And I've certainly spoken with people in our congregation who come from a variety of points of view, but I think I told you at one of the prior sessions here that after the vote within the conference, a number of people came in to talk to me and so on. And a number of people talked to me about a gay person and a gay member of their family or a gay colleague, and that, you know, it was been out of those kinds of relationships and actual friendships and family relationships that sometimes hearts are changed and opened. So change happens in different ways over time in our lives, in the world, in the church. At the same time, Cindy's mentioning education and training and so on. There's a group of scholars meeting August 7th and 8th, I just heard about. They're going to meet in Dallas, but they're focusing on preparing educational materials for local churches around these issues. So I don't know what's going to come out of that, but we'll stay tuned and see what might be available. So sort of yes to all of the above on that. What else? Sorry, okay.
This proposed breaking away of the Western Conference from the National Church, has anything like that ever happened before, at least in recent decades?
What do we call a doctor conference?
And if not, is there like in the bylaws a procedure for it to be done in a certain way?
After the Civil War, there was a major schism.
Actually, it was well before the Civil War. It happened fairly frequently in the 19th century. Annual conferences would walk away, and there's an independent church in Appalachia, which had at one point been an annual conference in Methodist Church. I forget the name of it, but and of course there was the split in 1844 over slavery, and that was when North and South split. And that's the answer to the first question. The second question is there a procedure? The answer is no. And the reason for that, as I understand it, is real simple. In the Methodist system, the fundamental seat of authority is an annual conference, not a general conference. It's an annual conference. So that means that there's essentially no one or no organization in the global United Methodist Church which has authority over what an annual conference does. That's why if our annual conference decides not to pay its apportionments to any higher thing and decides to ignore everything that they tell us, no one can do anything about it. So walking away is really easy. What we do after that is where it gets hard. But walking away, that first step, that's an easy step.
But what has come up before in conversations about this is the very fraught thing about retirement funds, monies, property, and all that. So are there discussions about talking to lawyers, about looking at the fine print of agreements, so that suddenly you're not behind the 8 ball on January 1st?
Sure, that kind of stuff would take longer, yeah, and those discussions are underway. I think that the Board of Pensions said that that whatever happens, they're simply going to honor the commitments they've got to everybody out there. So that issue kind of went away all by itself. And as far as things like who owns the property of the United Methodist Church back at headquarters in Tennessee, that's kind of stuff that you'd have to negotiate. But that was the case in 1844 also. In fact, one of the most interesting things there was that there was one Methodist Episcopal publishing house, and both the Northern Church and the Southern Church wanted it, and it ended up going to the U.S. Supreme Court and wasn't decided until after the Civil War was over. So it took them 25 years to figure that one out.
Yes.
If I could just tag on to what Dick said with another odd factoid, it goes to the idea of changing our minds. And I think it's my hope that people, I would hope globally, are saying, oh my gosh, what have we done? Well, if you've read the recent wonderful biography of Frederick Douglass, Douglass goes on a speaking trip to Scotland where he's talking about the evils and sins of slavery. And the Presbyterian Church in Scotland has just gone through a schism, and the dominant church in Scotland, the one that won out, had received massive amounts of funding from southern U.S. Presbyterians. And when Douglass came and talked about what this meant incarnationally, they had a change of heart. And the people started chanting at these rallies, send back the money, send back the money. And if you're familiar with the topography of Edinburgh, they even hung a massive banner from Arthur's Seat saying, send back the money. And they did. They remitted massive amounts of money to the Southern Presbyterians because they didn't want to be associated with the evils, the incarnational evils of slavery after the fact. So
it's been a good example, and just to say that, you know, when a decision like this is made, and a lot of people, I think, afterwards have been talking about sort of unintended consequences and so on, and a number of people have spoken quite publicly to say, didn't really, I wanted to follow what I thought and I think is the traditional understanding of Scripture, scriptural authority. I didn't want the whole Methodist Church, United Methodist Church to break up. You know, I didn't want to lose everything. And so, so there are people at different points in the larger body kind of saying, oh my, what have we got now? And is this really where we want to be? And how do we get maybe somewhere else with one another? The other thing that has been coming through, and I think that's reflected in those elections of more progressive delegations for the next General Conference, are people who said, who say, I still hold to a more traditional, what is for me, biblical understanding of sexuality. What I don't like is the mean-spirited punitive measures that were adopted. And people are saying, I may be conservative theologically and scripturally, but that's not any kind of Methodist I ever wanted to be. And that's not how I wanted our church to be with one another. So all those kind of conversations are really going on right now. And again, I think that's a sign of health for myself. Okay, one more. Let me go back to
Just to clarify, David mentioned a banner coming from Arthur's seat. I would like to be clear, you understand that Arthur is not a very large bishop. It's a hill.
Thank you for that very important
Clarification.
Thank you, Jerry, for clearing up that confusion.
Levity.
All right.
I actually do have one kind of procedural
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we, as a local congregation, or as a community, actually come to some statement what we are? Because, you know, as much as we kind of talk about this at a conference level and things like that, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, and to a certain degree, I think it's only fair to some traditionalists that if they don't want to be part of this community, they should be, as opposed to, you know, I hate having to push things to a nexus, but we do have to kind of have a position.
Yeah, well, we'll see, and that's what you can keep your lay leadership team and your thoughts prepared and talk to them, because that's what we'll be looking at, is what kind of process will we put together for ourselves, you know, whether it's gonna be, remember the old dinners for 12 Methodists, you know, maybe we'll have dinners where we'll all sit around and have a structured conversation of some sort, or maybe we'll do it by neighborhoods. I don't know how we're gonna do it, but the point is, really, I would say, I mean, part of it's gonna be the statement we come out with, but maybe the more important part is deepening our relationships with one another and with God through this time of talking and listening, a lot of listening and a lot of praying.
My only concern with that is that that's so internalized, and to a certain degree, I know there's been a lot of concern among some groups of the church that the way that we're represented by the outside public, and the fact that the disadvantaged people may feel as though they're not welcome here because of the stance of the church as a whole, that we somehow have to make it more clear where exactly we stand.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear it, and I hear it big time. And, you know, just this past week, 2 studies came out. One, further documenting the decline in church attendance across the board, not just United Methodist. And one documenting the drop in esteem with which clergy are held vis-a-vis other professionals. And there are people that are dissecting that, trying to figure out what that means. But my point is, this is sort of the larger context in which we're living. And then we have this huge sort of branding, messaging issue right now. And it's not helping us. Good grief. I mean, the last thing we need is this kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, there are many levels and many aspects of this that we want to really look at and think through and think about. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to stop it here because we've gone past our stated time. But I want to thank you all and say that I think it's fair to speak for any of us who spoke today, that if you have further questions, if you have follow-up questions, if you talk to somebody who maybe doesn't feel heard or something, please know that we are open for conversation. That's the point of these kinds of sessions. There will be more sessions like this. There will be more opportunities, but also that we're available for one-on-ones or whatever. So thank you all very, very much.
Barbara said, can we close with prayer, which is a wonderful idea.
I'm sorry, I didn't do it. All right, great. Who wants to pray? Tricia, you haven't said anything yet.
And she's so good at it.
She's a great trainer.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's great.
Loving and gracious God, we give thanks for this day and for each one of us here. We ask that you open our eyes and our hearts and our minds as we work towards the church you want us to be. As we listen to one another, as we grow in faith, help us to discern where you want us to be, how you want us to embody your church. Guide us in the coming months as we seek to do this together with one another. We give thanks for all of these things, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.